It's also worth digging deeper into exactly why cattle, despite being large grazing animals themselves, simply cannot replicate what bison do to a landscape. Because the difference isn't really about size or appetite. It comes down to evolved behavior developed across millions of years versus a few thousand years of selective breeding for an entirely different purpose. Cattle were domesticated, specifically to be docile, to graze steadily in relatively fixed locations, and to convert grass into meat or milk as efficiently as possible. Traits that make perfect sense for commercial ranching, but work against the kind of dynamic, unpredictable movement patterns that actually benefit a wild grassland ecosystem. Bison, having evolved on the open plains alongside predators, seasonal, fire, and shifting water availability for tens of thousands of years, retained an instinct to move constantly and unpredictably across large territories, following rainfall, fresh growth, and the changing seasons the way their ancestors always had, rather than settling into predictable grazing routines near a water trough or feed station. This difference produces measurably different physical impacts on grassland structure too, since cattle tend to selectively graze the most palatable, nutritious plants first, and repeatedly, gradually weakening those specific species through sustained pressure while leaving tougher, less palatable plants to spread unchecked, whereas bison graze more indiscriminately across whatever vegetation dominates a given patch before moving on entirely, preventing any single aggressive species from gaining the kind of long-term competitive advantage that eventually crowds out everything else. Researchers studying this exact contrast have specifically pointed to bison's tendency to focus grazing pressure on dominant grass species, the exact plants that would otherwise monopolize sunlight, water, and soil nutrients, as the core behavioral mechanism driving that dramatic difference between the 86% native species increase under bison grazing and the far more modest 30% increase measured under cattle grazing on the very same prairie. There's a broader ripple effect worth mentioning too, because a more diverse plant community doesn't just benefit the plants themselves. It cascades upward through the entire food web in ways researchers are still actively mapping out. Grassland bird populations across North America have declined more severely over the past several decades than almost any other group of bird species, and researchers increasingly believe that homogenized, uniformly grazed or ungrazed grassland habitat, missing the kind of varied patchwork structure bison naturally create, is a major contributing factor behind that collapse. Different grassland bird species require dramatically different vegetation heights and densities for successful nesting. Some prefer short, recently grazed patches with open sight lines to spot approaching predators, while others need tall, undisturbed grass cover to hide their nests entirely. And a landscape lacking that shifting mosaic structure simply cannot support the full range of species that historically depended on it. This is exactly why the experimental bison reintroduction at Illinois' Midwin National Tallgrass Prairie specifically included grassland bird monitoring as a core part of its research design, since restoring bison grazing patterns is increasingly viewed not just as a plant biodiversity strategy, but as a broader wildlife recovery tool with effects rippling outward through insects, ground nesting birds, and the small mammals and predators that depend on both. There's also a climate resilience angle to this story that's becoming increasingly important as droughts and extreme weather events grow more frequent and severe across the Great Plains. Beyond the drought resilience findings already documented at Konza Prairie, researchers studying bison graze grasslands elsewhere have increasingly focused on soil carbon storage as another meaningful benefit, since healthier, more biodiverse root systems generally sequester more carbon underground than the shallower, less varied, root structures typical of overgrazed or undergrazed monoculture grassland. While this specific area of research remains less thoroughly documented than the plant diversity findings, largely because measuring soil carbon accurately requires expensive, labor-intensive sampling across large areas and long time frames, early results from several ongoing prairie restoration projects suggest bison grazed land may offer meaningful climate mitigation potential, on top of its already well-documented biodiversity and drought resilience benefits, giving conservationists yet another practical argument for scaling up these reintroduction efforts across additional protected land in the years ahead. So what's the honest, science-backed version of this story? Stripped of viral exaggeration, but still genuinely remarkable in its own right. A small, historically significant bison herd, saved from near extinction by one determined ranching family, was patiently reintroduced to a fraction of its ancestral Texas range, starting in the late 1990s, and decades of rigorous ecological research from comparable prairie. Restoration sites across the Great Plains confirms exactly why that reintroduction matters so much. Bison grazing patterns can more than double native plant species richness compared to ungrazed land, dramatically outperform cattle grazing on the same metric, and produce plant communities resilient enough to weather severe drought without collapsing. Add in the soil compaction relief, the wallow wetlands, and the natural fertilization these animals provide simply by existing and moving across the landscape the way they evolved to for thousands of years, and you get a genuinely compelling case that rewilding degraded grassland with the right keystone species isn't nostalgic sentimentality. It's measurable, peer-reviewed, ecological science with results that consistently outperform anything humans have managed to engineer artificially. The real headline here was never a single dramatic release of thousands of animals transforming a wasteland overnight. It's something arguably more impressive, a patient, multi-decade partnership between conservationists and a species that already knew exactly how to heal this land if only humans were willing to step back and let it. If deep dives into real ecological science like this one are your thing, I'd make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next breakdown. And if this video helped set the record straight on a story you've probably seen exaggerated elsewhere, drop a like. It genuinely helps this channel keep making content like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. On top of that, bison engage in a distinctive behavior called wallowing, rolling and thrashing in dusty depressions to coat themselves in dirt as protection against biting insects and to help shed their thick winter coats. And over years of repeated use, these wallows carve shallow bowl-shaped depressions into the landscape that collect rainwater and seasonally transform into tiny wetland habitats, supporting entirely different plant and amphibian communities than the surrounding dry grassland. Add in the sheer volume of nutrient-rich, waste a herd of bison deposits across the landscape as they move, functioning essentially as free, continuously distributed natural fertilizer. And you start to understand why researchers increasingly describe bison not just as grazers, but as active landscape engineers, physically reshaping soil structure, water movement, and nutrient cycling in ways that machinery, budgets, or human labor simply cannot replicate at the same scale. This exact combination of behaviors, mobile bulk grazing, physical soil disturbance, wallowing, and nutrient redistribution is precisely why conservation organizations across the Great Plains have spent the last several decades pushing hard to bring bison back to as much of their former range as possible. The American Prairie Reserve in Montana has grown to encompass more than 400,000 acres of purchased, leased, and partner land specifically to give returning bison herds enough room to move the way they historically would have, since researchers studying that reserve have found that bison social bonds, herd movement patterns, and their broader impact on grassland birds, insects, and plant biomass all depend heavily on how much uninterrupted space the animals actually have to roam. Smaller experimental projects have popped up elsewhere too, including a conservation herd introduced to the Midwin National Tallgrass Prairie in Illinois back in 2016, specifically to test whether bison grazing could help restore native vegetation and support struggling grassland bird populations that have declined severely across the region in recent decades. Every one of these projects, big and small, keeps returning the same fundamental conclusion Konza Prairie's 3-decade study already demonstrated with rigorous long-term data: that native megafauna weren't just passive residents of the historic prairie, they were actively shaping and maintaining the very ecosystem structure that supported everything else living there, and removing them didn't just eliminate one species, it quietly destabilized an entire web of interconnected plant, insect, bird, and soil relationships that had co-evolved around their presence for thousands of years. Back at Caprock Canyons, specifically, the transformation has been genuinely visible over the years, even if it happened at a far more gradual pace than any viral video's dramatic before and after framing suggests. The herd's protected range has expanded significantly since that original 1996 donation, growing from a small enclosure to encompass thousands of acres of restored native grass prairie, with park staff actively working to combat invasive mesquite and juniper encroachment alongside the bison's own natural grazing pressure to help native grasses reclaim ground they'd lost over decades of altered land use. A dedicated genetic breeding program, run in partnership with researchers at Texas A&M, has also worked carefully to introduce additional genetic diversity into the herd from outside bison populations, confirmed to be free of cattle gene introgression, ensuring this uniquely Southern Plains bloodline survives for future generations, rather than facing the genetic bottleneck risks that come with any small, isolated population descended from so few original founding animals. Today, the park draws well over 100,000 visitors annually, many specifically hoping to catch a glimpse of the herd, and conservation groups have already begun discussing plans to eventually establish a second herd on adjacent shortgrass prairie land above the canyon escarpment, giving these animals access to seasonal range their ancestors would have used that the current canyon bottom simply cannot provide on its own. It's worth spending a little more time on that 30-year Konza Prairie study specifically, because the sheer duration of the research is exactly what makes it so credible, and it stands in sharp contrast to the kind of quick, dramatic footage that usually drives viral wildlife content online. Most ecological studies simply cannot run for anywhere close to 3 decades. Funding runs out, researchers move on, and short-term studies often capture a snapshot that later turns out to be misleading once you see how conditions shift across multiple years or decades. The team behind this research, led by ecologist Zach Ratajczak alongside colleagues at Kansas State University, specifically designed their study to avoid that exact pitfall, tracking the same experimental plots continuously since the station's founding, which meant they were sitting on decades of consistent, comparable data by the time they finally published their comprehensive findings. Ratajczak himself has pointed out something important about why this research matters so much scientifically. Bison were removed from more than 99% of the Great Plains before anyone was systematically recording quantitative ecological data, meaning an entire generation of ecologists studied American grasslands without ever actually knowing what a bison-influenced prairie was even supposed to look like in the first place. Every assumption about healthy grassland structure, plant density, and species composition that shaped decades of land management policy was effectively built on incomplete information, since the baseline itself, a landscape actively shaped by megafauna, had already vanished before serious scientific study began. That's precisely why this long-term reintroduction data carries so much weight. It's not just confirming a hunch, it's finally filling in a blank spot in ecological science that had been sitting there, unaddressed, for well over a century. The Flint Hills region where Konza Prairie sits deserves its own mention too, because it's not just any patch of grassland. It represents the largest surviving stretch of tall grass prairie left anywhere on the North American continent, a landscape that once stretched across roughly 40% of the entire continent before agricultural conversion and development wiped out the overwhelming majority of it. That scarcity is exactly why researchers treat every data point from this particular site with such seriousness. Because Konza Prairie functions as one of the last remaining living laboratories where scientists can actually study intact tallgrass prairie, ecology at meaningful scale, rather than trying to reconstruct historical baselines purely from fragmented remnants or secondhand historical accounts. The station operates as a designated long-term ecological research site supported by the National Science Foundation, a formal research classification specifically reserved for locations where scientists commit to gathering consistent data across timescales long enough to actually capture slow-moving ecological processes, the kind of gradual shifts in soil chemistry, plant community structure, and species interaction that simply cannot be observed in a study lasting only a year or two. Comparing management strategies side by side on adjacent plots, subjected to identical weather, identical soil type, and identical regional pressures, gave researchers about as close to a controlled scientific experiment as ecology in the real world ever gets, which is exactly why the contrast between bison-grazed, cattle-grazed, and ungrazed plots produced results specific. Enough to actually change how conservationists approach grassland restoration policy going forward. Picture a stretch of Texas land so degraded that the soil had literally turned to something resembling concrete, cracked, lifeless, and unable to soak up rain even when a storm finally rolled through. That is the landscape conservationists were staring at when they decided to bring bison back to a piece of their ancestral range in the Texas Panhandle. And years later, when researchers finally sat down and compared before and after data, what they found didn't just surprise them, it upended assumptions ecologists had held for decades about how quickly a broken grassland can actually heal itself. Before we go further, let's be honest about something most viral videos on this topic get wrong. The number of bison involved wasn't some single dramatic release of thousands of animals overnight, and if you've seen headlines claiming exactly that, you're looking at an exaggerated internet retelling of a much more patient, much more scientifically fascinating real story. What actually happened, and what the